joining. This is in fact going to be the last webinar of this year. And as you see, or you will have just heard, it's being recorded so that you can go back to catch it on the GOOS YouTube channel, or share it if you think somebody else might be interested. Today we're going to talk around the new Decade Coordination Office for Ocean Observing, and I'm delighted to introduce Terry McConnell here, who's just taken up the grand challenge of leading the Decade Coordination Office, and is going to take us through a little bit of the working and the functioning of what this office is, what it means to the decade, what it means to GOOS, what he thinks are the priorities, and and then be available to answer any questions. As with other webinars, the format is sort of half an hour of PowerPoint, 25 minutes of PowerPoint, and then we will have a sort of a question and answer session. There is the question and answer button, hopefully at the bottom of your screen, and so please feel free to start posting questions in there during the presentation, so that we then I can, as you think of them, and then we can catch up with those after the presentation has ended. And so just to give a little bit of background, I think really we actually began working with Terry behind the scenes when he was seconded to from Fugro to the Decade Coordination Unit, looking at what a Decade Coordination Office for Ocean Observing, and also one for ocean data, might look like, and how that will work. The TORs for this and the proposal for this was passed by the IOC Executive Council last year, and Terry took up post this year. We are extremely lucky, I would say, at GOOS to have Terry's experience adding to the decade work and the work of GOOS and the other ocean observing programs within the decade. Terry recently retired from Fugro, which is a private company, a Dutch geodatabase company, and was there a senior international business executive with a passion for building, growing, reorganizing and developing strategies for new and existing businesses. So taking all of that experience and learning and applying it to our field is part of what Terry is doing, and bringing a really successful track record with him. So as I said, Terry's not new to the decade, so he understands quite a bit of the functioning of the decade. Anyway, I'm not going to carry on in this way. I want to get on and let Terry speak for himself and explain the workings and the ideas around the Decade Coordination Office for Ocean Observing. So Terry, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Emma. I'm just going to share my screen there. Can you confirm you see the main screen?
It's perfect.
Okay, good. Took a lot of work to get that organized. Okay, thank you. I'm excited to be here. As Emma said, I'm acting as the lead for the Decade Coordinating Office for Ocean Observing. This Decade Coordinating Office, or DCO, was proposed for GOOS to sponsor in early 2022 and was formally launched, as Emma said, on July 1st of this year. There was some work that was done by Emma and Yeji, an intern before that, in getting things organized, but the formal launch was mid-year. As you can see here, with her inclusion of her picture, Emma, as a program specialist within GOOS, acts as the key sponsor for this Decade Coordinating Office, and is my key liaison partner with everything that I'm doing here. So GOOS sits very much at the heart of the Ocean Decade. It is the global home for key ocean observing expertise within the IOC UNESCO framework. Challenge 7 itself of the Ocean Decade, expand the global ocean observing system, which could be taken to say expand GOOS.
Okay.
I just noticed that the other day. The challenge aims to ensure that a sustainable ocean observing system endures well past the year 2030. And that's a key focus of mine as I go forward, is not just what I'm doing now, but how that will impact over the next 7 years of the decade, and how it will ensure a lasting legacy for an ocean observing system well into the next decade. And this, of course, all aligns very, very closely with the strategy and objectives of GOOS itself. So the topics I'll go through in this presentation are listed here. I'm trying to keep this to under 30 minutes so that we have lots of time to talk. I'm very keen to engage with you all and understand what you think about what we're doing and what we need to do. Basically, we want to jointly assess the synergies and overlaps that the Decade Coordination Office for Ocean Observing has with GOOS, and also to debate the vision for ocean observing during the decade and beyond. So these are some of the topics that I'm going to touch on. As Emma said, I've been involved with the Decade since pretty much the very beginning. I started in the DCU as the Data and Knowledge Management Officer seconded from Fugro in September of 2021. And I've had a seat at the table in regards to what the plans were, what the thought process was, and essentially what the effort has been over the first couple of years of the decade, and this is my interpretation of it, has been to grow the decade both from the bottom up and from the top down. From the bottom up, as we see on the left-hand side there, to as quickly as possible create a critical mass of activities, projects, programs, looking into the ocean itself. And from the top down to, over the first couple of years, to form an organizational structure that we'll see in the next few slides, of a Decade implementing partners and regional task force, national committees, and these Decade collaborative centers and coordination offices, of which the Decade Coordinating Office for Ocean Observing is one. So essentially grow from both directions at the same time. And this year and moving into next year is essentially crunch time, where these two growth efforts come together with a major intention to ensure that the activity going forward of all these programs and projects is very much cohesive and coordinated and as effective and efficient as possible. So that's where we're at now. We have a critical mass, very much so. We have organizational structures in place, and it's now time to put everything together and see how it all works as a single unit. Visually, what some of the organizational structure looks like, and this is pertaining to the data coordinating offices and the Decade collaborative offices, so the DCOs and the DCCs. And to answer your question, they are essentially the same thing. The only difference is that a DCO is sponsored by an organization within UNESCO, and a DCC, Collaborative Center, is sponsored by an organization outside of UNESCO. That's the only difference. Our mandates are the same. At the core of the Decade organizational structure are these three DCOs, two DCOs and one DCC. I'll explain that in a minute. And we, Ocean Observing, Ocean Data Sharing, and Ocean Prediction, are working very closely together to work towards a digital ocean data ecosystem that will support all of the efforts of the Decade going forward. So there's three components of the flow of data, from the sensor itself through to delivery as knowledge to a particular end user. That's the observing activity, the data management activity, and the analysis and prediction activity. And it is imperative that these three work together as a unit so that the flow of data is rapid, effective, and efficient, and can lead to end user decisions as quickly as possible. Ocean Prediction is a DCC in that it is sponsored by Mercator. Ocean Data Sharing is a DCO in that it is sponsored by the IODE, a component of UNESCO. And as I mentioned earlier, the Decade Coordination Office for Ocean Observing is sponsored by GOOS. So surrounding these, we have a series of thematic DCCs, most of them externally organized, hence DCC, Decade Collaborative Centers. And these focus on topics such as ocean climate, coastal resilience, fisheries and blue food, etc. And then surrounding that, and all of it coming together as a cohesive whole, are DCCs responsible for particular regional areas of the globe. What's not pictured here are another set of entities, Decade Implementation Partners, who are a series of groups who have skills, expertise, knowledge, relationships, community involvement in particular areas that have volunteered to act as a implementing partner in support of these particular DCC, DCO organizations. And then, of course, there's the national committees that are in place in many of the countries around the world. So that organizational structure is now pretty much in place, and it is slowly coming together with that critical mass of activities that we saw earlier to create that cohesive, coordinated, efficient, and effective whole that will be the decade for the next 7 years. So that was the decade at age 3, and we'll now look at the DCO, Decade Coordinating Office for Ocean Observing at age 1, since we just really got going this year. I have a terms of reference, as Emma mentioned, and I have a work plan and a roadmap for year 1 that has been prepared as soon as I got in chair and has been reviewed on a monthly basis to see how we're doing. But as I have engaged with the ocean observing community within the decade, assessing what is most needed and what might be some low-hanging fruit that we could take advantage of quickly, we've decided to focus on a handful of key priority areas. So first of all, support this community of ocean activity, ocean observing activity within the decade. Second, determine how to create a lasting impact and work towards that over the next 7 years. And at the same time, ensuring that GOOS's legacy past 2030 is front and center in what we're doing as an entity that could play a key role in ocean observing into the next decade. So there are 11 ocean observing programs and 91 projects involved with ocean observing and affiliated with these programs that are affiliated with the Decade Collaborative Office for Ocean Observing. So the pecking order or the structure is that a project reports and works with a program on that thematic or geographical area. And those programs come together as groups working with a DCO or a DCC working in that geographic or thematic area. So for ocean observing, which is obviously a very large part of any ocean activity, we have the bulk of the program. So 31% of the projects and programs within the decade are affiliated with this DCO for ocean observing. So it's quite a large group. I've listed them here. These slides will be available to you afterwards and we can answer any questions. But as you can see here, there is quite a broad spectrum of activity that we're looking at. So there's the deep ocean environment, there's the coastal environment, there's air-sea interactions, there's biomolecular observing and acoustic environment assessments. So it spans the whole spectrum of ocean observing. So it's a huge community, very large. And how do we support that? How do we get our minds around organizing and providing value from this particular Decade Collaborative Coordinating Center? If we look at where they're located, these are the headquarters of the various programs, the 11 of them. And as you can see, they're very much North American and Eurocentric. And that's one area that we'll be looking at going forward, is how can we bring in management, organizational activity, involvement from the Global South and from areas that are outside of these two key regions. The boxes in blue are those programs that already have a relationship with GOOS. So they're a part of GOOS, or they're related to GOOS, or they're coordinating with GOOS. So as you can see here, GOOS itself is very much front and center within the decade and within the ocean observing activity, specifically within the decade. So I may have some of this wrong. I think it's right, but we're looking at 5 of the 11 are GOOS affiliates. So you'll see what I mean by pivot in just a minute, but if we look again at where we are at age 1 and what the DCO focus should be going forward, creating a lasting impact is going to be key. So in that sense, I myself have, based upon what I've heard and talked with people about, am pivoting towards 2 key areas, pivoting towards value and pivoting towards a lasting impact. And I'll explain those in the next couple of slides. So looking to the future requires us to pivot away from a scientific focus towards a societal value creation focus. So away from selling scientific features and activity towards selling benefits. And the reason for that is that fully 80% of the funding for those 91 projects that I just mentioned that are a part of the observing community within the decade are funded by scientific organizations. So they're the standard group that we go to get funding for our activities. For the decade to be successful, we very much need to bring in the other community, the societal community and the commercial sector. So those people who are not interested so much in the science that's needed, yes, they acknowledge that, but they're interested in the outcomes. They're interested in the benefits that are going to be derivative from the science that we do within the decade. So in order for us to engage with and communicate to that community, which is needed for us to be successful, we need to speak a different language. And we've put together a training program to work with the programs and the projects on how to effectively pitch to non-scientific stakeholders, with a keen eye specifically on non-scientific donor groups, commercial entities, philanthropic groups, etc. So training material and resources have been made available. We have a few people, including myself, that are available to help the programs and the projects to figure out how to pitch themselves in a societal benefit fashion as opposed to a scientific feature fashion. To this end as well, 2 satellite events have been proposed for the Decade Conference. One on attracting donor interest, describing scientific value to non-scientists, and the other a matchmaking event, putting together scientists and non-scientists to assess where funding opportunities might exist within that community. So I'm not going to go over what is a value proposition and creating an elevator pitch. You may have had time to read that. This is just the first page of the training material. But it's key that we say what we have to say in as few words as possible, get to the point, get to the pitch, get to the request in 60 seconds. And it's also important that we focus a value presentation, not on the science being done, but on the value outcome, the benefit that will be derivative of that science. So here's an example. Tropical Storm Otis, October 24th, went from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in 22 hours. This caught everybody off guard, the scientists, the forecasters, the ocean, the Hurricane Prediction Office. It was just, what the heck happened here? There are studies going on. What happened? Ocean temperature is one obvious key area that they're looking into. And did they have enough sensors there? So if you were to look at 2 of the exemplars that are a part of the co-design program that GOOS has ongoing as a part of the decade, tropical cyclones and marine heat waves. Both of those are exemplars that have outcomes, benefits that could be beneficial to understanding why this type of event might have happened. Now, if you look at the pitch material in hand currently for these two, it's very much scientifically focused. They're scientifically organizational funded. So those pitches are perfect for those organizations. But what about the global blue economy sector, the shipping sector, the reinsurance sector? They have a keen interest in what benefits might be derived from these programs. So a value proposition or a value pitch should focus on what benefits might be derivative of the science that these two exemplars are doing. So more reliable forecasts, more warning, less damage, even to the point of trying to quantify, we think we can get more reliable forecasts by X%. We can reduce damage by such and such. That is not a topic that scientists typically really want to get into. But without committing to anything, we think our experience, our expertise, you're selling yourself and your track record, that what you're saying and what the possibilities are based on your experience as a renowned scientist can deliver. That's what these value propositions are all about. So it's taking you guys, the scientific community, outside your comfort zone and moving you into benefit pitching. So the flight attendants tell us always to make sure we put our own mask first before helping others. I'm taking that to heart in that I need help within the decade coordination office for ocean observing. There's just the one of me at the moment. The terms of reference call for 3. So I need to find funding and support for the other people. So I've gone through this process. What I think I'll be doing is pitching this opportunity to sit at the table, if you will, of the ocean observing program within the decade, to learn from and to potentially help influence those areas that the decade should work on that will be beneficial to, in this case, the reinsurance community. So they will be my target. How can I offer them a seat at the table within the DCO Ocean Observing to help with, understand, and bring their community to us and us to their community by having them as a part of the team? So I won't read out the value pitch, but this is what I've created, the value proposition for this community. And my next step is to start engaging with that community and see if I can be successful in getting some support for this activity. So another pivot is towards creating a lasting impact. And I mentioned this one earlier. The end user applications, the knowledge that comes out of everything that we are doing as a ocean observing community is very much the tip of the iceberg. It's what everybody sees. It's the sexy part. It's those digital twins that everybody's talking about that people can use and magically get answers to all their questions. None of that is possible without the bottom part of the iceberg, which is within the decade, those 3 DCO, DCC trio that I mentioned earlier for ocean observing, ocean data sharing, and ocean prediction. We need to, as a team, come up with the best practices, the most easily accessible technologies, the tools, the guidelines that will facilitate an efficient and rapid flow of ocean observational data from the sensor all the way through to the end user as knowledge. Getting this knowledge into the hands of the end users as rapidly as possible is going to be key to the success of the decade. So we 3 work together very closely, and a key outcome that we will be working towards is a digital data, ocean data ecosystem that is usable, available, to the entire community, not just the global north and the developed nations who have the money and the resources and the people, but to the global south and the developing nations who need to be able to do this, maybe even more importantly than the northern nations, to understand their part of our globe. And lastly, pivoting towards the lasting impact, Vision 2030, an activity of the decade that is leading up to the conference in April, has each of the challenges, all 10 of them, a working group and co-leads assigned to assess what is the vision for that challenge. What would be considered a success if achieved by the year 2030. So in our case, what does success look like for Challenge 7? And Patricia Milosevic and Joe O'Callaghan are the two co-leads for this committee of about 12, 14 people. Emma and I are working closely with Patricia and Joe to try and look at this. We're doing an assessment of what people think now, what people have thought previously, what we're doing now from an ocean observing perspective, and what people are telling us we should be doing in the future, and looking at the gaps and so on. Essentially, we need to coalesce all this information into 10 pages, most of which is recommendations and a roadmap. So after this information gathering exercise, we need to quickly come to a point where we're looking for what I call BHAGs, and that stands for a big, hairy, audacious goal. What 3 or 4 big, hairy, audacious goals could we identify and challenge ourselves with that, if successfully achieved by the year 2030, will mean that Challenge 7 has been fully met? And we're looking to those now. And I'm also now looking to you as a community to help us to gather in potential big, hairy, audacious goals that we can then vet, assess, and see if they're realistic, see if they're achievable, see if they stretch us enough as well. We don't want them to be easy. So all ideas are welcome, and I look forward to whatever you can pitch in our direction. That brings us back to GOOS. Again, the global home of the ocean observing expertise. It's a key part of the IOC UNESCO effort, and as such is right at the heart of the decade. GOOS itself is not an endorsed program or project or DCO. It sits in the background supporting all of the work that I do, all of the work that the ocean observing community does. What will GOOS look like 2030 and beyond? And I know there's a strategy in place for GOOS and a roadmap to get there. So we need to coalesce what we're doing within the Decade Coordinating Office for Ocean Observing with what GOOS is doing in the strategic planning to make sure that we are aligned as we go forward into the next decade. So we're jointly working towards ensuring that legacy. So with that, I'll close off half an hour, which is right on target. And I look forward to our discussion. And I hope that there will be lots of questions coming from you. But I will be looking to see if these questions that I have can be answered during this next 30 minutes. How do you perceive this relationship between the Decade Coordinating Office for Ocean Observing and GOOS? What are your thoughts on an ocean observing system vision for 2030, these big, hairy goals? And do you have any feedback on how we can improve matters either within the decade as a whole or within the Decade Collaborating Office for Ocean Observing specifically? So with that, I will hand it back to Emma to manage the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for keeping to time and leaving us enough time for some questions and answers. Now, I don't see any in the question and answer section, so I don't know if anybody's ready to type some in. I have some prepared because I have some questions anyway, about a little bit about what you think are, what what have been the biggest challenges for you in terms of setting up the DCO? And yeah, so I throw that one out there and encourage everybody else to start typing in some questions into the chat box at the bottom that says Q&A. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Biggest challenge, I guess, has been getting up to speed. The first few months and even now, it's been very much drinking from a fire hose, trying to understand everything that everybody's been doing in this community for so many years before I came on board. My background is in the commercial sector. I've had lots of overlap and done a lot of work with the academic sector and scientific sectors around the world in different organizations. So the mindset is very much different, but trying to get the mindsets fused so that we can take advantage of both ways of thinking. So drinking from a fire hose, gathering in as much information as possible, getting to know the people. I've done a number of trips to various workshops and programs that the programs have set up, and that's been extremely helpful. These face-to-face meetings are always incredibly beneficial. And getting to know the work and the struggles, I guess. Struggles in the sense that the enthusiasm for the decade is through the roof. There's just an incredible amount of enthusiasm. There's also a heck of a lot of volunteerism going on in response to this enthusiasm, and a part of that has led me to believe that resourcing and pitching to that alternative funding community is incredibly important. Get them to the table as quickly as possible. So how do I do that? How do I find out who the relevant parties are? So it's been very much a learning process over the past 5 months, trying to come up to speed on everything that people are doing and everything that people wish to do going forward.
Great, thank you very much, Terry. So we've got some questions coming in, and I encourage people to fire some more there. First one is from Peter Pearsons, and he's asking, actually, stealing a question that I had in my back pocket as well. How do you see the relationship between the DCO for ocean observing and the one for data sharing? And I might also sort of throw in the ocean prediction one there as well. And what have you learned about the interaction to date? So how do you see that relationship, and what have you learned about the interaction to date that would be sort of insightful for us moving forward?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. It's a great question. I've been working with Peter since September 2021 and was working with him and putting together the DCO application for the ocean data sharing. Jan Bart Kaliwart is now the lead for that group, who I also work with quite closely. To answer your question, Peter, there are two parts, or if you add in ocean prediction, there are three parts of the same whole. And it's incredibly important that we view them that way. Ocean observing obviously takes place in a different physical location out in the ocean somewhere, or from some remote sensing platform. And ocean data sharing takes place more back in the office and in data centers. However, if you strip away the physical attributes of those activities, the flow is seamless. We need to make sure that data collected at a sensor starts its life journey in a fashion that is usable, findable, or fair. So it's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, in the sense that it has proper metadata, that it is stored in a location that will be accessible to other parties, not just the observers. So how we make sure that what happens at the coalface, if you will, at the observing site, is supportive of and seamlessly integrated with the ocean data sharing structural elements, so that data is then consumable by the ocean prediction environment. is what is going to be a key element of success for the decade. So a basic answer to your question is that we're one and the same, in that we are three parts of the data flow from sensor through to delivery as knowledge to the client. So I work very closely with Enrique Alvarez, who's the lead for Ocean Prediction from Mercator, and with Jan Bart. And the three of us are actively now trying to find time is the problem, trying to find time to put together a strategy paper, uh, not with any specifics, but with the concepts in play of what a digital data ecosystem should look like, should achieve for the decade.
Okay, so in a sense, it's going to be watch that space for
Yes.
that definition. But if I heard you correctly, it's partly about ensuring fair data right
Yes.
the way through to stakeholders. So very quick one actually, which I might sort of answer from John Zhang saying, do you have an email for follow-up discussions? I guess we could leave that in the PowerPoint presentation if it's not already there.
Good point. I'll make sure it's there. It's not.
So John, we'll place that in the PowerPoint presentation that will be available from the GOOS website following the webinar link after the session. So you can follow up there. A nice question from Stella Alexandrov, really saying that that you talked, Terry, about doing value-orientated science with non-scientific communities in mind, like in the communication. What is your vision or strategy for including stakeholders and communities in the very early stages of even defining those values? Have you thought about that aspect at all?
Yeah, and more specifically, GOOS has thought about that with the co-design project. The co-design project, simply by its name, is all about co-designing the scientific project with the entire community at the table. And that entire community includes the end user, the stakeholder, the people that will derive the benefit from that particular project. So it's the co-design concept should be more broadly accepted, utilized with all of the activity that we're doing. There is a tendency within the scientific community to look at scientific outcomes and aligning with scientific goals and activities, which is very much focused on data and scientific outcomes. And that is how you pitch to the existing donor community, the scientific groups. So we need to add to that picture the end user, the societal groups. And there's two groups. There's the policymakers, obviously, that need to be saying what they feel is going to be important, that they feel they're willing to put into policy and enforce and oversee. There's the communities themselves. Can we include them in the discussion about what they as a community are worried about? And then there's the commercial sector, which supports the policymakers, supports the community, but has their own mandate. And it is, by its nature, a financial mandate. You know, how can the global financial community get involved in the blue economy? There's been many meetings sponsored by many organizations over the past couple of years of the financial community, the banking community, the investment community. How can we get involved? How can we support the blue economy? Because we need to as a part of the global community, because of the sustainability and global health, etc., but also because it makes sense financially. And we can't shy away from that. That drives a lot of things in the world. So how do we engage with that financial community? And one thing they're saying to us that's coming out of these meetings is that they don't have enough data to understand the risk portfolio, the risk profiles that will affect their investment decisions. So they don't have enough data. That's right in our bailiwick. I mean, we can help you get the data, but we need to understand what data they need. And in order to understand that, and this goes for the commercial sector, the reinsurance sector, the shipping sector, and so on, essentially, what is the question that they have about their activity that if we, as an ocean observing community, can answer, will have a distinct value proposition for them to their particular mandate and requirements, but also have a value proposition for us in that we deliver something of benefit to the broader community. What is that question? And the only way you're going to be able to answer that question is, well, the only way you're going to be able to know what that question is to engage them from the beginning, to sit at the table with them and shut up and just listen. What keeps them up at night? What do they need? What drives them? When you get that information, then you can start formulating how we can work together. How can you work with them? So essentially, we need them at the table from the get-go, and that is going to require a different set of routines in setting up these projects. Who are your stakeholders? Who's going to benefit from what you're doing? Specifically who, and how do you get a hold of them? How do you get them at the table?
So with that in mind, in some senses, the work you're doing to try and attract support towards the DCO is perhaps bringing some of that perspective on board through the DCO's activities that I'm sure would be helpful for all the programs. I'm going to change tack slightly. There's some other really good questions coming up. Brian Melzian has asked how can he learn, or how can we learn more about the 47 programs and 292 projects? These are not all under the DCO for ocean observing, but perhaps he's saying that in future presentations he'd be interested to learn more about some of the programs themselves, or have links to URLs and things available. I guess that's something that we could think about to have available on the website in a section around the DCO, certainly for the ocean observing ones. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, the oceandecade.org has a section there that lists all of the programs. Each program, and I believe each project, has a one-page site where you can read a brief blurb on what they're doing and what their focus is and who the leads are, who you can contact to get more information. So that'd be your best source of information, is oceandecade.org.
Okay, now changing tacks again, we have an interesting one from Christina Forbes, who actually has a hand up, but Christina, I'm not sure that we can sort of turn on the microphones. We're kind of mainly going through the chat, so I'm glad you put it into the chat. But she's from the Coast Guard Office of Search and Rescue, SAR, saying that we have great challenges in SAR for many remote maritime areas where there are not many environmental observations and adequate modelling systems to reproduce the currents and winds for the mission of saving lives. So from their perspective, the expanding of ocean observing network and modelling efforts into remote areas, into the Pacific, would be a successful outcome of this effort. So there's a kind of a marker there. I don't know if you have any thoughts, or whether that would be something we transmit through to the 2030 vision team.
No, it's a perfect question. It's a key end user with a specific need or a requirement for a benefit that could be solved by a scientific project or expansion of projects. So you are exactly the type of person that we need to be speaking with. A question for the community that's been on my mind based on a few conversations recently. We all know that funding is difficult to come by. We need to try and attract more funding. We're going to focus on the non-scientific donor community. So the question I have for everybody here is, we as scientists tend to always try and do the best that is feasible for the funding that we've got. And we're trying to answer scientific questions, so we want the most accurate answer, the most accurate data, the highest resolution. Is that needed for what you are asking for in the SAR environment? Is it needed that you know ocean temperature and ocean observing, information to the nth degree of accuracy? Or would it be just as good, fit for purpose, if you will, to have more spatially a bigger spatial resolution, so more sensors in the spatial area, but at a lower physical measurement resolution? So essentially, less expensive equipment out there, but more of them. So you get the spatial density, even if you're getting less physical property measurement resolution. Is that fit for purpose for what you are going to need? Will it allow us, using the same amount of money, to get more data, more dense spatial data in an area of interest that could be constrained by the high-end systems that are spatially, positioned here and there to give you a baseline constraint? But can we use our money differently in order to meet the expectations, the benefits, the questions that you have as an end user community?
Okay, thank you, Terry. I'm going to jump to another question here. This one from Joseph Nolan. What role do you see for the GOOS regional alliances with the DCO and their interactions with regional or geographic DCCs?
Yeah, a direct point of contact would be very beneficial to engage with the regional DCCs. Tell them what you're doing, what your activity is, what your strategy is for that region, so that they can incorporate that into their own plans and their own community in that region. Through GOOS and Emma, we have a close relationship, but understanding let me back up. What we're doing now, we did a series of Google surveys of different communities, trying to understand who's doing what, where. So what physical measurements, what biochemical measurements, et cetera, are being done in what locations around the world. So what is the baseline for observing at this point in time? And then with the other communities, what needs to be done going forward, and then looking at the gap to assess where we need to focus our attentions. You are a part of the answer to both those questions. What is going on now in your region? What do you see as the regional representative should be done and needs to be done for the future? And what gaps you have? That type of information would feed in extremely well to the Ocean Vision assessment, as well as the ongoing assessment of what we're doing from an ocean observing perspective within the decade. So contacts with myself and Emma through GOOS, but also directly with the regional DCCs would be extremely valuable.
Okay, so we could have a think about that for the GOOS regional alliances and what that might mean. Another question actually around collaboration here from Andrea Valentini, who is related, I think is the leader of the DCC for coastal resilience, and is saying that, that the observations and modeling, data availability, this is really at the core of improving coastal resilience. And perhaps that the DCO Ocean Observing and the DCC for Coastal Resilience could share efforts to identify effective strategies of bringing stakeholders together, especially in the coastal zone, maybe kind of compare strategies in that respect, and that would be useful.
I agree completely. The Coast Predict program is a part of the Decade Collaborating Office for Ocean Observing Community. So I work with Nadia quite a bit. At our most recent programs group meeting a few weeks ago, the format that we have is that one of the programs makes a presentation to all the others, and we engage in a discussion of how all the other programs can benefit from what that program is doing, and vice versa. Nadia presented Coast Predict and the DCC for Coastal Resilience at our meeting 3 weeks ago, and there was quite a lot of animated discussion that followed on from her presentation about how the other programs can work together with you guys to enhance what you're doing, and vice versa. So I agree completely. It's all about communication. That's a key part of my role. Is that was actually another pivot that I eventually took out of my presentation, was a pivot towards community, and making sure that I bring people together as best as possible to achieve cohesive outcomes.
Great. So just out of interest, Christina has written some more bits and pieces, but also sort of being a bit, adding in, I share it, around particularly needing surface currents and winds for the air sea search and rescue, and particularly around small islands. These are kind of absent from the global models, and so I guess this is an important data point to add into the thinking, in terms
So
of high
on that
resolution
again,
models.
right, exactly. If we could get some more detail from Christina about what type of resolution and detail she needs for these ocean currents and surface conditions, what type of resolution specific in the measurements, then we'd have a better understanding of the potential for deploying lower resolution sensors over a broader area, getting more data, more spatial resolution, if that will meet her requirements. So more detail on what you need, what is acceptable, what's fit for purpose for the question that you have, would be incredibly useful in that co-design process.
Indeed, and I think anyway. So I have another question for you. I'd just like to get through as many as possible before we close. So this one is from Manfred Zieler again, talking about will you compile or document the needs of the end users, for example, the banks and the insurance companies or the maritime industries, as you move through this? Something that might be available to the ocean observing community, or you might share it. It's a good point. If you're doing this work,
Yeah.
how would you think of sharing that information?
That's a really good point. We do have within the oceandecade.org, the network that they have set up. There's an ocean observing group site, community of practice, that's where I put all of my documentation, everything I want to share with the community. I tend to put in there in the media section. So I can create a different section that contains that information. But that's a really good point. It's very valuable knowledge, like search and rescue information. We could put that in there that people can access. So good point. I'll try and set that up.
Okay, great. And I'm going to go back to an earlier question because it seems to be appropriate, and add something to it. This is from Rebecca Martone. How is the DCO envisage working to define and overcome barriers and create opportunities for stakeholders and community members to participate in ocean observing? And I might add, you mentioned that the global south, certainly in the programs, is not so well represented at the moment, or at least areas that that haven't got so much ocean observing infrastructure. Have you had some thoughts, maybe not in the next month, but as you work through the decade, hopefully, about that kind of overcoming barriers and creating opportunities, and with a kind of a thought to areas that are not yet well represented in the ocean observing sort of set of programs?
Yeah. So part of the work of the Vision 2030, and it will be, I guess, contained more in the background information. I don't, some of it at a very high level might come through in the white paper, but the white paper is only 10 pages long, so it's going to be quite focused. but the work of the Vision 2030 group, of which Emma and I are a key part of, is to identify who's doing what, where, and what needs to be done in the future, where and what. So identifying that, particularly with a focus on the Global South, is a key part of what we're trying to do. As an example, we've been looking at the OceanObs 19 papers that were written. Who wrote them? What institutions were they working for? And what areas geographically were they focused on? And from that, we can see the Global South is quite poorly represented, which is because the other groups have the money and the funding and the people to write all these papers and be involved in all these conferences. So we can show where the gaps are. What we need to do is bring them to the fore, talk about them a lot, figure out how to fix them, and what can be done to improve that situation. Because an interesting statistics that came out is that the amount of activity going on in the North Atlantic outstrips pretty much everywhere else. But the importance attached to the North Atlantic is at the bottom of the heap when it comes to what we need to focus on in the future. And the interpretation there is that it's not important, but it's that we're already focused there so much, let's focus elsewhere. So if you look at what needs to be done, the statistics that came out of those surveys, it was all in the South. And if you look at what we're doing now, it was all in the North. So that's a key indication that we've got an issue that we need to address going forward. And that will be a part of the Vision 2030 outcomes.
Great. Thank you, Terry. I think it is something that we should have a think about how to, and an interaction with the decade coordination unit on that. So we're kind of 3 minutes to be at the top of the hour. So I don't think we have enough time to answer any more questions. I want to say thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to add just before I wrap up?
I just see that there's still 22 questions in the Q&A. If I could get a list of, though I haven't been paying attention to that, but I'd like to get a list of those questions, and I'll try and answer them offline by email and potentially set up meetings if needed. But that's I'm quite pleased to see the interest, so that's good. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, Emma.
Great. Okay, so we'll leave it there, but you will carry on. And I also see that some active questions going to Christina Forbes with suggestions of contacts and data. So that's a really good exchange as well. I would just remind everybody that the session is recorded, and so if you wanted to share it, or somebody was interested in that information but couldn't make the session today, that will be available ultimately through the GOOS website, or search for the GOOS YouTube channel. And then I would also suggest, if you haven't already, signing up for the GOOS sort of news update, and then you get notified of future webinars, etc. Because I think we will have a few more on the decade as things evolve towards the decade conference, which will be in April next year. So thank you all for joining and your interaction in the questions and answers. There's some great questions there, and I think that it's really helpful for Terry in the development of the DCO. So we'll just say thank you very much, and thanks for joining, and hope to see you at another GOOS webinar in the new year. Okay, thanks very much.